When I was a child, a film came out that many of you, I'm sure, have seen, The Boys from Brazil. The premise was a little bit silly, but the film featured a secret plot hatched by a load of old Nazis living in South America, led by none other than Dr. Josef Mengele, famously played by Gregory Peck. The film hit cinemas in 1978, and the real Mengele died, unknown to anyone, in Brazil in 1979. The point is, the film's premise built on that of an earlier novel and film, The Odessa File by Frederick Forsyth, which was published in 1972 about a reporter investigating a secret conspiracy of former Nazis in West Germany. The 1970s were a fertile time for such conspiracies, not the least of which was the discovery in 1972 of Martin Bormann's remains in West Berlin. It all appeared to be quite possible that such an organization like Odessa and such dastardly plots such as outlined in The Boys from Brazil could exist, perhaps to create something called the Fourth Reich, a secret Nazi-dominated shadow government in West Germany to succeed the failed Third Reich that apparently died in May 1945. Or did it? Well, I'm happy to tell you that while I can't prove the existence of the Odessa organization, I can tell you that a plot to place the Nazis into power in West Germany definitely existed, and was the brainchild of a senior Nazi official who coincidentally managed to escape from war-torn Berlin in the same night and in the same group as Martin Bormann. That man was Werner Naumann, a peripheral member of Hitler's inner circle. No one ever talks about him, but he was a very powerful and influential man nonetheless. Naumann was the last state secretary in the Reich Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda, Goebbels's propaganda ministry. A Prussian, he had joined the Nazi Party in 1928. Unlike many of the senior party figures around Hitler, Naumann was too young to have fought in World War I, having been born in 1909. A political economist, he joined the Sturmabteilung, the SA or Brown Shirts, and by the time Hitler came to power in 1933, he held the rank of SA Brigadeführer. In 1938, Naumann became the personal aide to Dr. Joseph Goebbels, propaganda minister, and in 1942 was promoted to state secretary. Also a member of the circle of friends of the Reichsführer SS, Heinrich Himmler, he was made an SS Gruppenführer, equivalent to a World War II Army Major General. Naumann played an important role as state secretary in the propaganda department, being Goebbels's second-in-command, and he also represented Himmler's financial interests in the massive industrial firm Kali and Salz, now called K&S, one of the huge industrial enterprises that Himmler had brought under his influence, along with such firms as IG Farben, Siemens, Ferrostahl, Otto Wulff, and Unilever, whose boards contained many senior SS officers by war's end. Naumann had remained in Berlin during the Soviet attack on the city in April 1945, as did his boss, Goebbels, who moved into Hitler's bunker with his family towards the end. Naumann was also in the bunker virtually every day. Following Hitler's death on the 30th of April 1945, Goebbels had assumed authority in what remained of German-controlled Berlin, but his failure to arrange an end to the battle raging for the city led to his own decision to die, his wife Magda deciding to die with her husband, but after first having had their young children poisoned in their bunker quarters. Naumann later claimed that he had offered to take the children from the Goebbels to prevent this grisly end. But when that had proved impossible, he and Dr. Goebbels had absented themselves for some hours, while Magda, with the assistance of SS dentist Sturmbannführer Helmut Kuntz, dealt with the children. Naumann also took no part in the burning of the corpses of Dr. Goebbels and his wife in the Reich Chancellery Garden, following their deaths. That task was delegated to Goebbels's SS adjutant Hauptsturmführer Gunther Schwegemann. Later that night, on the 1st of May 1945, a breakout of surviving bunker staff was planned. A breakout that included Martin Bormann, now party minister, and several other prominent Nazi officials. Werner Naumann had received a final promotion himself following Hitler's death. He was now the propaganda minister, because Hitler's last testament had promoted his boss Goebbels to Reich Chancellor. With Goebbels' death, the power now lay with Hitler's other appointee, Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz, now Reich President and operating a rump government in northern Germany. On the 1st of May, Dönitz had asked Lutz Graf Schwerin von Krosigk to form a new cabinet, as was his right, and Dönitz dispensed altogether with a propaganda ministry, so Naumann's new position as a minister effectively ended on the 2nd of May 1945. Nonetheless, alongside Bormann, Naumann was the most senior surviving Nazi to try to escape from Berlin on the night of the 1st to 2nd of May, aside from a third man, Reich youth leader Arthur Axmann, head of the Hitler Youth. It is fascinating that of these three most senior Nazi fugitives, one would disappear seemingly into fresh air, while the other two would successfully escape Berlin, when so many of their compatriots in the escape groups failed to do so, and not only escape, but actively plot and plan for some kind of covert Nazi revival in the post-war Western Allied occupation zones of Germany. 10 separate escape groups were organized, and Naumann was placed in charge of Group Number 3, a group which also contained Martin Bormann, Hitler's chief pilot, SS Gruppenführer Hans Bauer, Hitler's personal surgeon, SS Sturmbannführer Dr. Ludwig Stumpfegger, and later Arthur Axmann, meaning that all of the senior Nazi leaders were in the same group. Exchanging their senior SS and party officials' uniforms for nondescript field-grey army and SS tunics, devoid of rank insignia and wearing steel helmets and armed to the teeth, these groups of fugitives attempted to get clear of the Reich Chancellery area, mostly using the subterranean U-Bahn tunnel system, trying to infiltrate through Soviet lines to exit Berlin to the northwest. In my video series about the fate of Martin Bormann, link in the end screen, I showed good evidence that Bormann was intending to try and reach Dönitz's headquarters to take his place in the new Nazi government, and we must also assume that Naumann had some ultimate destination in mind as well, perhaps the same destination as Bormann. The escape and evasion of the bunker groups is fairly well documented, and in Naumann's group there were some 25 men, including Hitler's second pilot Bates, Goebbels's former aide Schwegermann, and Goebbels's SS driver Rack, and Arthur Axmann, who joined Group 3 during the evasion from the following Group 4. As they trekked through the U-Bahn tunnel system, they came upon stations crammed with terrified civilians and German troops, including many wounded. Group Number 3 allegedly missed a critical turn in the darkened tunnels and surfaced at Stadtmitte station. They came up into Gendarmenmarkt opposite the Max Reinhardt Theatre, but heavy fighting there forced them back, and they tried to move up Friedrichstrasse. Stopped again at the Weidendamer Bridge, a tank barrier prevented further movement. A handful of the last remaining tanks, including Tigers, came up, and using these, an attack was made over the Weidendamer Bridge to create a breach, allowing thousands of German soldiers and civilians to pour over under intense Soviet fire. Many witnesses later claimed that Martin Bormann was killed during this attack, either riding in or on one of the tanks, which is patently ludicrous, as such vehicles would have attracted the majority of the Soviet fire, and anybody with any sense would have stayed well away from them. Or he was killed when one tank blew up next to him. However, Naumann, Axmann, and many of the other survivors of the fight who broke through at the Weidendamer Bridge later claimed that Bormann was still alive afterwards, for example, seen sitting on the steps of a bombed-out house on the corner of Schiffbauerdamm and Friedrichstrasse. The surviving members of Group 3, including, we can assume, Bormann, now struck out for the Lehrte railway station, and on reaching the wrecked station, the group divided up after a confrontation with Soviet troops. Bormann and Dr. Stumpfegger walked east along Invalidenstrasse towards Stettiner station, while Naumann, Axmann, Rack, and Schwegermann walked west towards Altmoabit. Interestingly, in the latter group, Naumann, Axmann, and Schwegermann all managed to escape from Berlin. Axmann later claimed to have come upon the dead bodies of Bormann and Stumpfegger behind the bridge where Invalidenstrasse crossed the railway line. and his testimony, and his alone, has been taken by most investigators and many historians to prove that Bormann died in Berlin in the early hours of the 2nd of May 1945, apparently by cyanide capsule. I and many others strongly dispute this, so as Axmann was not a reliable witness, was a Nazi to the end of his days, and changed his story several times. Naumann would later tell people that Bormann had survived the war. He also said that Bormann, quote, was a Soviet spy and must have arranged beforehand where to meet the Red Army advance units. Bormann now lives in Moscow, end quote. Personally, I think Naumann made such comments to muddy the waters and assist Bormann's escape, rather than such an idea would have any foundation in reality. As for Werner Naumann, declassified CIA documents that I obtained state that Dr. Naumann made it all the way to the Elbe River, the other side of which was US territory, but was unable to find a way over and was captured by the Soviets. However, it is certain that he was not identified by the Soviets, for he would have been whisked off to Moscow to join all the other failed escapers from Hitler's bunker that the Soviet NKVD secret police was interrogating in its own search for what happened to Adolf Hitler. Instead, Naumann was able to remain in a POW camp in eastern Germany for about 4 weeks, after which he escaped and successfully went to ground in the Soviet sector, using an assumed name and working first as a farm laborer. In 1946, he crossed into the French occupation zone, where he completed an apprenticeship as a stonemason to support himself. He worked as a mason at a large industrial concern in the Ruhr until February 1950, but this was a useful cover for his real work. For Dr. Naumann had begun to organize a secret network of former Nazis and SS officers that would become known as the Naumann Circle, an embryonic Fourth Reich. In summer 1949, Naumann established contact with former Foreign Office official Dr. Todenhöfer, who had been Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop's liaison man at Goebbels' propaganda ministry, and whom Naumann knew well. Todenhöfer had excellent local connections with the French occupation authorities, enabling him to expedite Naumann's legalization, that is, his arrest and the beginning of his denazification process, so that he would be able to live under his real name and work. Naumann spent 1 day in the French transit camp at Tuttlingen and then was released with documents stating that he had served 5 years imprisonment, when in reality Naumann had spent 5 years living and working incognito in the eastern and western sections of Germany. A denazification hearing was then initiated at Tübingen. In 1950, Naumann had some meetings with the French occupation authorities, partly to discuss the threat of Soviet communism and his experiences in anti-Soviet activities in the wartime propaganda ministry. In return for Naumann's legalization, the French proposed that he work closely with them in the propaganda field in the struggle against communism and, quote, for a European Union under French domination, end quote. In return, the French offered Naumann economic security and a nice house in their zone. Naumann, however, had other ideas. He wanted to find a position in the US occupation zone, and met with a man called Lucht, formerly of the Foreign Directorate of the Propaganda Ministry, and by 1950 in the import-export business. Lucht gave Naumann a job in his business as a manager, and his denazification proceedings were transferred from Tübingen to Düsseldorf, which was in the British occupation zone. Naumann now began to build his network. He connected with Colonel General Heinz Guderian, one of Hitler's most senior army commanders in World War II, and also established connections to Deutsche Partei, a conservative political party founded in the West in 1947. In North Rhine-Westphalia, he connected with the FDP, the Free Democratic Party, founded in 1948. Other connections were people such as Karl Kaufmann, the former Gauleiter of Hamburg. In February 1951, Naumann had a meeting with Hitler's favorite commando leader, Otto Skorzeny, who was living in fascist Spain. He established contact with Germany's most decorated man, Hans Ulrich Rudel, an avowed Nazi to his death, and German lawyer and later Bundestag and European Parliament member Ernst Achenbach. In the 1930s, Achenbach had been managing director of the Adolf Hitler Fund and worked in the German embassy in Paris during the occupation. Naumann re-established contact with Arthur Axmann and his own extensive network of former Hitler Youth leaders. The Naumann circle was enormous, some 700 to 1,000 former prominent Nazis and SS who set about infiltrating the Free Democratic Party and other political organizations and veterans groups. The aim? The moving back to positions of power and influence of old Nazis who were still believers and all united by a dread fear of communism. Naumann's underground Fourth Reich included a degree of spy tradecraft as well. Its members were extremely secretive, and communications were made using personal couriers, and false addresses and code names were employed. Monthly meetings of the Controlling Committee chaired by Naumann were held from February 1952 onwards. The international aspects of the organization were also extensive. Due to the diaspora of Nazis abroad, many via secret rat lines to South America and elsewhere, Naumann's organization had contact and dealings with many Nazis in South America, including some close to local governments. 7 former Nazi Gauleiters were members of the Naumann Circle: Friedrich Karl Florian, Alfred Frauenfeld, Josef Grohe, the aforementioned Karl Kaufmann, Hartmann Lauterbacher, and Gustav Adolf Scheel and Paul Wegener. Other top Nazis included SS Standartenführer Gunther de Alquen, who was the publisher of the SS newspaper Die Schwarze Korb, SS Obergruppenführer Werner Best, head of the Gestapo Administrative Office, and later the civil administrator of occupied Denmark, SS Oberstgruppenführer Paul Hauser, senior wartime general, Goebbels's former adjutant Schwegemann, SS Brigadeführer Franz Six, former Einsatzgruppen mass murderer, SS Brigadeführer Edmund Wesenmeyer, Reich plenipotentiary in Hungary and a convicted war criminal, SS Brigadeführer Paul Zimmermann, SS and police leader in the Soviet Union during the war. The overall aim of infiltrating political organizations in West Germany was to eventually supplant the democratic parties and turn the country back towards a Nazi-type governance, some kind of successor to the Nazi Party, in effect a Fourth Reich. Some of Naumann's infiltrated people worked to get laws passed to grant a general amnesty for war criminals and other attempts to cleanse the recent past. The FDP in particular became the focus of Naumann's activities, the French press noting in 1952 that it was transforming itself into, quote, a nationalist and reactionary movement of the extreme right, end quote. US intelligence believed the FDP and affiliated organizations were part of an extremist bloc. So how successful was Naumann's organization? 1 in 5 FDP members of the Landtag, the Regional Assembly of North Rhine-Westphalia, had a Nazi past. Similar Nazi infiltration was found in other German states from the 1950s through to the 1970s. For example, in May 1950, the New York Times reported that 53 former Nazi Party members held elected seats in the Bundestag, the West German parliament. However, Naumann's organization would ultimately prove to be stillborn due to the actions of the British. British intelligence had become interested in Naumann's activities and had started secretly wiretapping the organization's communications, and it became clear that the Naumann Circle was engaged in a plot to overthrow the German government of Konrad Adenauer, and that if this came to pass, the position of the Allied powers in Germany would be imperiled. At the time, the activities of the British, Americans, and French were specified by the 1949 Occupation Statute of Germany, which came into effect on the unification of the three Western Allied occupation zones into a new political entity called the Federal Republic of Germany, or more commonly known as West Germany, in 1949. The former occupation powers retained certain reserve powers in order to protect their national interests. The British High Commissioner to Germany, Sir Iveon Kirkpatrick, ordered, on the night of the 14th to 15th of January 1953, the arrest of Naumann and 6 top members of his organization in Düsseldorf and Hamburg. They were taken to Werl prison. A thorough search revealed manuscripts of speeches that Naumann had made detailing his organization's objectives, his diaries, and a very large amount of incriminating correspondence and other files. However, the reaction of the West German government was rather strange when told of what the British had uncovered. Incredibly, they didn't completely believe the British, and the West German press and a lot of the public were angry, believing the British action violated their newly restored German national sovereignty. Interior Minister Robert Lehr told the British that they already knew all about the Naumann Circle and that it was small, and such action by the British had been unnecessary. On the 1st of April 1953, Naumann was released due to ill health, and the British handed the other 6 detainees over to the West German authorities. It was only after the German government actually read through the documents that the British had seized that they realized what a threat Naumann's organization actually was. They discovered for themselves Naumann's extensive contacts not only in Germany but also with Nazis in Spain and South America and some of their financial supporters in other European nations. However, the Germans released all of the arrested men without any bail restrictions and then set a trial date. Incredibly, Naumann then announced that he would stand for election to the Bundestag, the federal parliament in Bonn, as a candidate for the far-right DRP, and though banned from public speaking, he had plenty of support. The West German authorities managed to stop Naumann from standing for election by having the government of North Rhine-Westphalia, acting as a denazification tribunal, classify him as a Class II offender, a category automatically preventing him from standing for public office for a period of 5 years. The affair dragged on for a while until, on the 3rd of December 1954, the criminal court at Karlsruhe declared that there was insufficient evidence against Naumann and his compatriots and dropped all charges against them. This is rather strange, but it may be a reflection of the amount of old Nazis in positions of power in West Germany. The figures were astounding. A German investigation in 2016 discovered that for more than 2 decades after World War II, almost 100 former Nazi Party members, including senior officials, held high-ranking positions in the West German Justice Ministry. From 1949 to 1973, out of 173 leading West German lawyers and judges, 90 were former Nazi Party members. In the year 1957, for example, 77% of the Justice Ministry's senior officials were former Nazi Party members, which was higher than the actual Nazi period. Small wonder, then, that there was little appetite in the West German Justice Ministry to prosecute Nazis like Naumann and his co-conspirators. Incredibly, most of the Naumann Circle men who had infiltrated political parties like the FDP remained in place. Though Naumann's prohibition for standing for election was removed after only 2 years, he never stood again. He was a director of the Busch-Jaeger Metals firm in Lüdenscheid, which was owned by Dr. Goebbels' stepson Harold Quandt. Werner Naumann died in Lüdenscheid in 1982 at the age of 73 and is buried locally. So ended one attempt we know about to set up some kind of Fourth Reich in West Germany. It would not be the last. Many thanks for watching. Please subscribe and share, and also visit my audiobook channel, War Stories with Mark Felton. You can also help to support both of my channels at PayPal and Patreon. Details in the description box below.